Hello, I'm Earl Fontanelle. You are listening to The Schwepp, The Secret History of Western Esotericism podcast, online at schwepp.net, and today we're speaking with Ivan Miroshnikov, who is Pro Futura Scientia Fellow at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study and Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Egyptological Study of the Russian Academy of Sciences. A man who knows a thing or two about the Gospel of Thomas, one of the most interesting and indeed most esoteric early Christian documents that survive. Ivan, thank you so much for coming on, talking to us on the podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So, the Gospel of Thomas, before we even get into it, we've talked about it already in episode 124 of the podcast a little bit, in the context of twinship as a kind of theme in late antique religions. But it would be great to go back to basics, talk about what this text is, describe it, and also talk a little bit about the sources, how we know what we know, because it's pretty complicated and it's significant.
That's true. And the first thing to know about the Gospel of Thomas is that there are actually two texts that bear this title. And for a 19th century scholar, the Gospel of Thomas would actually refer to this so-called infancy gospel, which is also called, according to its title, the Gospel of Thomas, and which has nothing to do with the text we're going to discuss today. The reason for this is that the Gospel of Thomas was discovered only recently. So it is only after the famous Nakamadi discovery in 1945 or 46. It's only after that we realized that, the fragments that were known formerly, some of these fragments also belong to the Gospel of Thomas. So today, some scholars still use the title the Gospel of Thomas for the infancy gospel, but usually they would also add the word infancy just to distinguish the two.
Yeah.
So we have 4 manuscripts of the Gospel of Thomas. One of them is complete, and it's in Coptic, which is the latest stage in the development of ancient Egyptian. And the 3 other manuscripts are fragmentary, and they all come from the site in Middle Egypt called Axtarincus. They are all in Greek. So the story begins in the end of the 19th century when these 2 explorers and papyrologists from England, Grenfell and Hunt, went to Egypt to, trying to find as many papyri in Greek as possible. And what they did was great because they did find a lot of stuff, but they also didn't really care much about, the archaeological context and stuff like that. So we don't always know, we don't always have enough information about where, in what context were objects discovered. But in any case, in the end of the 19th century, they went to this ancient city called Axtarincus, and discovered a fragment from a codex, one leaf from a codex, which contained a number of maxims, aphorisms, each one beginning with this formula Lege Iesus, so Jesus says, and they published a book on the very next year called Logia Iesu, a newly discovered source for historical Jesus and stuff like that. So basically, when they discovered this one leaf, they thought that what they found was something similar to what Eusebius describes in his church history. So Eusebius mentions this early Christian writer, Papias. This Papias apparently wrote some sort of a text, an exegesis of the sayings of Jesus, the sayings that he collected from, people who inherited the sayings from early Christians. So, there is some sort of a chain of tradition going back to Jesus and his disciples.
So this is like a Christian hadith literature.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly like that. And so they thought that they found that. And that's why they used the word logia in the title of their book. Even though when you actually look in the text of the Gospel of Thomas, the word logion is never used. It's always the word logos. So the word logia actually comes from Eusebius, from the title of this lost work by Papias.
Got it.
But people still use the word. I personally prefer to use the word saying because I think that's more neutral. So anyway, several years passed, and these two papyrologists discovered more fragments. And these two additional fragments, were assigned numbers 654 and 655. Oh, by the way, the fragment that they discovered before that was assigned the number 1. So this entire Axyrhynchus series, which is almost 100 volumes now, it begins with number 1, which is the Gospel of Thomas.
And it's actually come into the news recently because there's been some possible foul play with the Axyrhynchus papyrus.
That's true. Yeah. Not possible, actually. I think it's been proven beyond doubt that, there has been some crime involved. So they published these two additional fragments, and they thought that one of them, that is 654, is also from the same text.
Right.
Which, I remind you, was called, according to them, something like Logia Iesu. And the other one wasn't, because it so happened that this other fragment, 655, actually didn't have any of this Jesus says formula.
Okay.
So they thought that this is something completely different. And then 40 years passed, and the Nakamadi Library was discovered. Now, I'm sure some of the earlier guests at your podcast said something about the Nakamadi discovery and what actually is postulated about how it was discovered.
Yeah, but by all means, go over it again.
Yeah.
It's fascinating stuff.
It is a fascinating story, and there is now a huge discussion among scholars if we actually should trust the narrative that has become like kind of the traditional story of the Nakamadi Library. So, the official story goes that some peasants, or the fellahin, were looking for this fertile soil called Sabach, and just all of a sudden bumped into some sort of a jar that contained 13 or 12 codices.
Yeah.
This story then continues that, it says that they divided the codices between themselves, and then one of them actually used some of the parchment leaves to, start a fire, to make some tea. It's possible that it's true, but also there are reasons to think that, actually they were doing something else, and it was not as innocent as they described. And the story about, looking for Sabach was actually just something they said just to hide the truth. Like, for instance, looking specifically for ancient black market, which is something that happens a lot.
Yeah.
So anyway, in one of these codices, which is in the codex that is today called Nakamadi Codex 2, one of the texts, the second text in the codex, is titled the Gospel of Thomas. Yeah. And when scholars looked into this text, when they translated it, they realized that the three fragments published by Grenfell and Holland actually bear witness to the same text.
So we have the text complete, but in Coptic translation. We have some fragments of the Greek Vorlagen of that text. And from that evidence base, it's not the best evidence base we could wish for, but it's still pretty good. We can tell a lot about this text. And
it is pretty good. And there was this British scholar, Larry Hurtado, who died recently and who published a very nice study about the Axyrhynchus fragments. And he did some, statistical analysis. So 3 copies of a text on papyrus in Greek, all dating from before the year 300, is actually, well, it's not a lot, but it's more than we usually have.
Right.
For instance, the Gospel of Mark is, if I remember right, there is only like 1 copy of the Gospel of Mark that comes on a papyrus fragment that dates to this period. So 3 copies is actually significant. It does say that this text was, relatively speaking, popular.
Yeah.
At least in the area where it was discovered. But of course, when we look at the Coptic manuscript and at the Greek fragments, we discover differences. So in any case, working on the Gospel of Thomas means paying attention to all evidence and also always, use critical thinking and trying to look both at the Coptic text as it came down to us, but also to try to see through it and see the Greek Vorlage, the Greek text that actually stands behind the Coptic version.
Now, if you can put it in a nutshell, the complete version we have, the complete Gospel of Thomas, is agreed by everyone to have undergone some level of recension. But it's also agreed by everyone to have some really, really early material in it, right? That's really interesting because early Christian material is so hard to come by. Genuinely early, sort of the 1st century CE. And that's what everyone really, really wants. That's like the prize in early Christian studies. So I wonder if you can lay out what we can say about the different strata of this text.
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, maybe just a few words about the genre.
Yeah.
So the Gospel of Thomas is a collection of sayings. And that's, of course, very important because when we hear the word gospel, we usually imagine something similar to what we find in the Bible. So some sort of a narrative about Jesus, which ends with his execution and then resurrection. So the Gospel of Thomas is not that. And it belongs to a well-known genre of saying collections. Sometimes the scholars call it gnomologia, although this term is not well attested. So texts like this existed in antiquity. And we, for instance, have this famous text by Epicurus called the Kyriai Doxai. And we have other texts like Lucian. And of course, we know that texts like this were very easy to revise, to adapt to a certain situation. I mean, you don't need to be very creative. Like, if you want to add an episode to the gospel, to like a canonical gospel, you would need to come up with a way of how to insert it into the narrative, right?
Right. And
here you can just,
And sometimes we can see the places where things have been inserted and go, aha, this guy didn't do enough work to hide the fact that he's inserting something.
Yeah. And with sayings collection, it's easy because, we're not expecting from a sayings collection to follow a certain, logic. Very often, all of a sudden, the topic changes, the type of sayings somehow mutate and stuff like that. What is interesting is that it is, on the one hand, important to remember that the way we divide the Gospel of Thomas into sayings is ultimately our invention. So the Coptic manuscript does not really signal in a clear way where a new saying begins. So the text runs uninterrupted. But in one of the Greek fragments, we actually do have some, system that signals that, here the first saying ends and this next saying begins. So ultimately, we know that, of course, for an ancient reader too, this was a collection of discrete units. But the way we divide the text into units is ultimately our decision. And it's important to remember that even though there is, so to say, canonical way to divide the Gospel of Thomas into 114 sayings, this is sometimes debatable. The way we divide it into sayings is debatable.
Gotcha.
So going back to your initial question, yes, I would say that when we look at the Gospel of Thomas, we very often see what I would call mixed signals. When it does seem unusual or strange or, remarkable that two sayings appear, so to say, under the same cover. So, for instance, the Gospel of Thomas begins famously with this so-called incipit. These are the sayings that the living Jesus spoke.
These are the secret sayings.
That's right. These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Thomas wrote down. And who finds an interpretation will not taste death. So when you read an incipit like this, exactly like you said, that these sayings are secret and these sayings are somehow cryptic.
Yeah.
So they actually require interpretation. You then look into some of the sayings and see that there is actually nothing cryptic about them. This is especially true about the some of the parables, which we also have in the Synoptic Gospels. And what is striking is that in some of these parables, we actually have the conclusion, the hermeneia, provided. So there is this famous parable, which we also have in the Synoptic Gospels, about a man who was receiving visitors and sending his servant to invite the guests, and then all the guests refuse. And then the man says to his servant, go outside to the streets and bring back all those whom you happen to meet. And then it continues with this phrase, businessmen and merchants will not enter the places of my Father. So at this point, Jesus of the Gospel of Thomas finishes the parable and, gives you the kind of the morale of the story.
Right.
So Hans Martin Schenke, who wrote a very illuminating article about the composition of the Gospel of Thomas, he actually believed that these sort of inconsistencies point to a rather complicated composition history behind the extant text of the Gospel of Thomas. And this list can be easily continued. Like, for instance, there's this saying 12, which many people like because it connects the Gospel of Thomas with this so-called Jewish Christian strand in early Christianity. So when disciples come to Jesus and ask, when you depart from us, who will be our leader? Jesus says, well, the text is kind of difficult here, but something like, regardless of where you are, go to James the Just or James the Righteous, for it is for his sake that heaven and earth came into being. So when you read this, outside of the immediate context as a separate unit, you think that the Gospel of Thomas must be very, very fond of James the Just. And therefore, the Jewish Christian tradition that is associated with this character and, the Church of Jerusalem, which he, according to tradition, led and stuff like that. The problem, however, is that the very next saying 13, contains a conversation between Jesus and several other disciples, including Thomas. And it does sound like Thomas, in this saying, is elevated above all other disciples. So he is somehow even higher in this hierarchy than James. More importantly, there are sayings in the Gospel of Thomas which exhibit this clear disregard for the material universe and specifically for heaven and earth. So the phrase, heaven and earth came into being for his sake is not really a compliment.
Right.
According to the Gospel of Thomas. So again, the text seems to be sending us some sort of mixed signals. And I'm not even going to start with the problem of the relationship between the Gospel of Thomas and the Synoptic Gospels, because this is a huge topic and a lot of literature has been written on this. And it's very clearly connected with one's personal beliefs in the end.
Yeah. Would it be safe to say, without taking any sides, that everyone agrees, or let's say there's some scholarly agreement that some of the material in the Gospel of Thomas goes back to the same source as some of the material in canonical Gospels?
Well, I would definitely agree with what you just said.
Okay.
But I think, recently several rather influential monographs have been written whose authors, primarily Gathercole, are very skeptical about there being any, independent tradition in the Gospel of Thomas, anything that looks like synoptic material and doesn't come from the Synoptic Gospels.
Got it.
This is, I would say, a rather radical approach, and I think, indeed, there are some instances in the Gospel of Thomas where we do seem to have something very ancient and something that may be even closer to historical Jesus than what we have in the Synoptics. I think there is this amazing article published even before the discovery of the Coptic text by a British scholar, Skeet, which is called The Lilies of the Field. And in this very short article, I think Skeet demonstrated brilliantly that this famous saying about the lilies and how they neither toil nor spin that this saying is actually corrupt in the Synoptic tradition, whereas the fragments from Aksarynkhos preserve the original wording. And I mean, I personally find this brilliant, and there are other people who find this brilliant. But again, even in this instance, there is no consensus. So, some scholars would say, no, Skid was wrong. And, there are other possible explanations for the difference between these texts.
Okay.
But I mean, I personally find this conversation a little bit not boring, but it's very hard to add anything new to this discussion, simply because I think every possible position has been taken already in this.
Until we find another horde of amazing documents from Egypt, we should just chill. So
I think it's more fun to, discuss the Gospel of Thomas as it is.
Let's do that then.
Yeah,
thank
you. Do that.
Thank you very much for the the text-based intro. It's always great to know, or at least I think it's always great to know. When you have a book that comes out in a scholarly edition, it's easy to forget that this is the result of people taking often damaged, hard to read, handwritten documents, distilling them into nice typeface, printing it, translating it, and putting it out as though that is the document we're dealing with. And you forget that these are messy manuscript stories that have provenances and stories, the story of the discovery and sending of the Aksarynkhos papyri to London in big crates is part of the story of biblical studies. It's also a story of colonialism. It's also a story of the birth of text criticism and all kinds of interesting stuff. And this is all relevant to looking at this material.
And it is all the more true for the Gospel of Thomas, where scholars very often actually rely on editions, and we tend to kind of canonize, the edition produced by a scholar that everybody respects, even though sometimes, in some instances, there is a lacuna, there is a hole in the manuscript, and it is ultimately impossible to tell how this lacuna is to be filled.
Yeah.
And therefore, even if the brightest of all scholars suggested a restoration of this lacuna, it is still just a hypothesis. And, it shouldn't be taken like the absolute truth, which unfortunately sometimes happens.
Yeah. Well, it's an easy trap to fall into. You're reading a text, you've got the apparatus criticus at the bottom of the page, but you're just reading the text. You don't really want to keep looking down there every 5 seconds. So you just accept the readings. Now, let's talk about this text and what's in it. Obviously, one of the reasons people are so interested in this text is because first because there was this possible Eusebius connection, and this might be like a truly, truly early Christian sayings of Jesus himself. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Nevertheless, it's clearly a text that's very relevant to early scripture, right? This isn't like some 5th century infancy gospel that only survives in Slavonic or something. This is like a serious piece of early Christian literature. As far as we can tell, fairly popular, because we have these 3 manuscript fragments. You can say it's not unpopular. And so what's in the text, and what we're especially interested in, I think, is something we've already established. This text frames itself as being esoteric, right? So it says, this is secret stuff. By gaining the proper interpretation of this, you will attain eternal life. So there's a kind of esoteric hermeneutic, maybe a bit of a lese-mysterian idea here. Like, by reading this, and if you get it, you're saved. What's going on with this text that makes it so interesting and unique?
Well, I think it's definitely true that this text was composed in a way that it's intentionally provoking. So I must say that I myself, when I was a teenager, I read the Gospel of Thomas for the first time in a Russian translation, and I was just amazed and enchanted by the fact that this text is very powerful in its verbiage, but it's not always clear what exactly it's trying to say. So it invites you, it kind of lures you in, and that's of course not unparalleled. So again, there is excellent scholarship by John Kloppenbarg, where he discusses various sorts of similar so-called wisdom literature composed of sayings, maxims, that are meant to educate, but also are meant to push you towards this personal spiritual exercise, some sort of a sapiential research, I think is the term that Kloppenburg used.
Yeah.
And one interesting parallel is what we have in Pythagorean tradition, where there is this long list of, maxims that, sound really meaningless or weird, rules of what you should and shouldn't do. And then, there's a long tradition of how these maxims should be interpreted. So in this sense, the Gospel of Thomas is not unique, but it certainly is, I would say, rather marvelous work of literature. When you look at the Gospel of Thomas, you would initially probably be disappointed because it might give you an impression of being completely chaotic. And it is true that many scholars tried to find some sort of a structure, some sort of a system arrangement in this text, and they failed. But we can still see that there is a certain poetic side to this text. And there are certain formal techniques involved, which allows you to appreciate the mind behind this text. So the simplest device that is used, it's well known, the use of catchwords. When certain sayings are connected by means of some identical word, identical phrase, or maybe different words that sound alike, the homophones. And this is quite, characteristic of this text. It appears a lot, and it immediately adds a new level to the text. So, you not only try to interpret a saying as it is, but also you look at the saying around it and see how the text jumps from one saying to another by means of what device. I might say something that is completely outside my area of expertise, but again, I remember that as a young man, I read Bhagavad Gita for the first time. And I remember that there was this excellent introduction by a Russian Indologist who may have got the idea elsewhere. I don't know if it's original, but what he claimed is that, the text was meant to be memorized. And it's not linear like, text that we usually read. Because when you memorize the text, it kind of exists in your mind in its entirety. And that's probably something that was intended for the Gospel of Thomas, if I can speculate about that, the text is very short and it's easy to memorize. And once you memorize it, you can kind of see certain echoes inside the text, even in those instances where, sayings are not actually adjacent in the manuscript, but they become adjacent in your mind. So it's definitely, I think, well designed in this sense.
So the hermeneutics that will save you may well be an internalization of the text and then combining and recombining and going, this maxim is actually speaking to this one over here. And the two, when you put them together, you get the true meaning, this kind of thing, this sort of refashioning the text once you've internalized it.
Exactly. And there is other, hint at that the text was supposed actually to be memorized. And there are a lot of these rhetorical tools used in it, especially the chiasm, the way the text is, a particular saying is structured so that, it's not just a nice saying, but it also follows a very strict formal pattern, like A, B, B, A, B, A, B.
Yeah. Well,
sometimes quite complicated, but still you can find it if you look for it.
I like the fact that you work with the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study, and you managed to squeeze in an ABBA reference there.
Guilty, yes. So this is the formal side of the text, and I think it's important that we pay attention to it because when there is no story, when there is no narrative, this kind of formal element plays an especially important role.
Right.
So now, when it comes to the content, the text is called the Gospel of Thomas, and this is actually the title that we find in the Coptic manuscript and also in some of the church fathers who seem to be referring to this literary text. There has been a lot of discussion about the name that we find in the very beginning of the Gospel of Thomas. So in the Coptic version, it says, these are the secret sayings that Jesus spoke, and Judas Didymus Thomas wrote down. So a lot of ink has been spilled about this name, Didymus Judas Thomas, because it's unusual. You will not find it in the Greek New Testament. Didymus and Thomas is, of course, the same thing. So Thoma means twin in Aramaic, and Didymus means the same thing in Greek. Also can mean testicle, but probably not here.
Yeah.
So Didymus Thomas is, of course, somebody we know. It's this name appears in the Gospel of John. But then Judas is weird, the Judas part. And it's been observed early on that Judas Thomas is the name that appears in a number of sources that come from Syria. We have several early Gospels, early manuscript of the Gospels in the Syriac language where Didymus Thomas becomes Judas Thomas. We have this amazing text called the Acts of Thomas where the protagonist is also called Judas Thomas. So for this reason, people, I think, still think that this text probably comes from Syria. Now, the problem is that I don't really see anything particularly Syriac or Syrian about it. And an even bigger problem is that when we look at the Greek fragment, which also preserves the incipit of the Gospel of Thomas, we realize that there is not enough space in the lacuna for this name, Didymus Judas Thomas. And it must be, it's an either-or situation.
Got it. Either Judas or Didymus.
Yeah, exactly. So you cannot have both. And I am now thinking that maybe we just put too much trust into the Coptic manuscript. Maybe this name is actually something that entered the text only when the Gospel of Thomas was copied into the Nakamadi Codex too. Because there is another text in the same codex, which is called the Book of Thomas, where we have the same name, Didymus Judas Thomas, and nowhere else in the entire Nakamadi collection. I'm wondering if maybe these two texts were intentionally kind of brought together, made more similar in order to, for whatever reason, and that initially the name Judas was just not there. So in any way, I'm particularly very skeptical about this Syrian connection. And this of course, has some relevance for our discussion because there has been some attempt to connect the Gospel of Thomas to Syrian monasticism, Syrian mysticism, and stuff like that.
Absolutely. So the question of a Thomasine Christianity in Syria is very much something that has a wide scholarly following, but are you saying possible but not proven? I'm
saying that we cannot exclude the possibility that the text was produced in Syria, but again, this is not something we should take for granted.
Right, so we don't have the evidence.
No. And I'm also very skeptical about this whole idea of Thomasine Christianity. So there are several aspects to it, so to say. One is that there are these three texts that I just named, the Gospel of Thomas, the Book of Thomas, and the Acts of Thomas.
Yeah.
And all three feature the same character. It has been suggested that this represents a sort of, a collection of texts associated with a particular strand in Christianity, Thomasine Christianity. I think it's safe to say that today we are all more or less very skeptical and done with this theory. I don't think there is enough evidence that would connect these three texts in particular to each other. And another, and I think more important problem is that in early Christianity, in early Christian studies, there is this unspoken assumption that if there is a text, there is a community.
Right.
So, there is the Gospel of Thomas, there is the Gospel of Matthew, and there is the community of the Gospel of Matthew. There is the epistle to Romans, and therefore there is this Roman community to which the Apostle Paul is writing. Now, this is actually, I think, a big problem. And if we look at the Gospel of Thomas, we will see that this text is actually not very communal to begin with. The thing that the Gospel of Thomas is stressing again and again is solitude, isolation, an anchorite way of life. God is not with people who are many. God is with the one who is all alone. And the Gospel of Thomas is especially keen about this, using this very mysterious term, monachos, which of course immediately reminds us of monks. But then if we are to think that this word monachos was actually already in the Greek text, and the Greek text was actually produced before the monks came to be, the word monachos should actually mean something else. And in my dissertation, I'm actually trying to connect it to similar terminology that we find in Philo of Alexandria, Clement of Alexandria, who also speak about being a monas, being a single one, being an entity, being a unity. So I think it is very unlikely that there was a community, in the sense that the word community is usually used in early Christian studies, behind the Gospel of Thomas. On the other hand, of course, when we read this text carefully, we again find occasionally some reference to what we can call communal values. Like in saying 48, the implication seems to be that we should maintain peace with each other. Like if you make peace with each other in this one house and say to the mountain, move away, it will move away. Of course, we can interpret this as some sort of an allegory, and that the two in one house is not the two individuals, but rather, God knows what. But I think that, if we go through the text, we'll see that it does kind of imply occasionally that, there is some interpersonal communication presupposed by this text. Love your brother like your soul, says Jesus in St. 25. So I think there is a community, but in the sense of like a virtual community. So we're talking about a very loose network of like-minded individuals, people who read this text, who do the sapiential research associated with this text, but who do not, share, communal meals or attend liturgy together. Right. That doesn't seem to be what the Gospel of Thomas is about.
This model that you're outlining seems to be something that, granted that we're speculating, but seems to be something that makes sense for a lot of the texts we find in early Christianity, whereby we know there were Christians gathering in their sort of proto-churches, even in the very early years, before we can even point at Christianity and say this is a separate religion. We still have these groups of people. They're doing some kind of liturgy, but at the same time, we know that all manner of interesting texts are circulating among some of them. And you may well have been going to a normal Christian, proto-Orthodox, let's say, or at least everyone there thinks they're Christians, right? Group on Sunday or whenever it was, doing some liturgy. But then after the ceremony's over, someone says, hey, have you read this Valentinian tract? And you say, no, I haven't seen that. Let me check that out. And you take it home and read it and you go, oh, wow, that's interesting stuff. And like, hey, have you seen the Apocryphon of John? It's fantastic. And this sort of more esoteric, or at least more intellectually diverse, interesting, weird stuff seems to have been circulating among people that we would just call early Christians, right?
And of course, all this, as you said, is speculation, because it's very seldomly that we find some actual evidence for this side of things.
Yeah.
But I think what is interesting is that, again, if we look at the material side, material evidence, the Greek fragments that came down to us, the 3 manuscripts, they all seem to have been produced for private use. And that's, again, what this British scholar, Larry Hurtado, claimed, and I think he was right. So, one of them is a so-called epistographon. So it's a roll that was used for some, documentary business-related stuff. Then the business-related text was no longer important, so it was crossed out, and then the other side was used to inscribe the beginning of the Gospel of Thomas. Another manuscript is also a roll. So none of them point to some sort of communal use. They all seem to be items used by individuals for their private individual, self-perfection, stuff like that. So you asked about the distinctive features of the Gospel of Thomas. So I think we covered some of them, but there is, of course, more. So one feature that I think is remarkable and immediately strikes you when you observe it is what the Gospel of Thomas doesn't have. And that's, for instance, the name Christ. So throughout this text, the protagonist, the teacher, is called Jesus, and this epithet Christ is never used, and that's fascinating.
Now, what's the significance of this epithet Christ for those who are not familiar with early Christianity or Jewish messianic thought or anything like that?
Well, exactly what you said, like that Christ connects Jesus with the prophetic activity of ancient Jews. Christ is the Messiah predicted, prophesied by the Jewish prophets. And the Gospel of Thomas is very clearly it's immediately clear that this text is very not fond of Jews and their practices and their rituals and their scriptures and everything that, is associated with them. My Dr. Father Antti Marinen, he actually wrote an article about, the Gospel of Thomas and Judaism. And he pointed out that it looks like the author of the Gospel of Thomas actually have never seen any living Jews. So Jews is probably some sort of a concept in the mind of the author rather than group of people that actually are around. This is actually quite clear that Christ, either because of its connection with the Jewish heritage or because of its significance for the proto-Orthodoxy, we would never know. But the word Christ is never there, it's always Jesus. And what we learn about this Jesus is also interesting. So in the Gospels, Jesus teaches, but he also performs miracles. He performs a lot. He heals, he resurrects the dead, converts water into wine, you name it. In the Gospel of Thomas, he does not perform a single miracle. Apparently, this is something that is completely not relevant because we might suppose has nothing to do with this sapiential research that the Gospel of Thomas is about. It's very hard to believe that the author of the Gospel of Thomas didn't know that some Christians called Jesus the Christ,
right?
Or that these other Christians believe that Jesus performed miracles. So this is an intentional choice,
right?
Most likely, not a reflection of some weird tradition where Jesus was just this wisdom teacher or whatever. And then there is some other stuff that is quite difficult. Like, for instance, does the author of the Gospel of Thomas know about crucifixion? Does he know that this text, that Jesus was actually, he died on a cross? The answer is probably yes. And we do have a saying, this is saying 55, where Jesus says, whoever does not hate his brothers and sisters and take up his cross in my way will not be worthy of me. So the cross is there.
Yeah.
There was this very remarkable movement in early Christian studies when scholars tried to compare Jesus of the Gospels to a cynic wisdom teacher, a cynic philosopher. And, this school of thought, they even thought that the reference to the cross by itself is not necessarily about crucifixion. It might be a common trope, and they found some parallel passages in Epictetus and in some other later Stoic writers. This is all very interesting, but I mean, for me, again, it's hard not to think that, it's hard to imagine somebody who didn't know that Christ died on a cross.
Yeah.
The important thing is that this is the only instance where the cross is mentioned, and it's not mentioned in connection with the, sacrifice Jesus made for humanity. Yeah. So this is not there. So whatever, the author is trying to tell us in the saying, the cross itself is not, the key message. It's some background information at the most. So even if Christ died on the cross, which is a possibility, it's not really important. It's not something that you should be bothered with as a, sapiential researcher.
A bit like in Paul, right?
Mm-hmm.
In Paul, we don't get a lot of Jesus' life story. We just get this more divine principles and pneuma and being reborn in the living spirit and all this kind of stuff.
Or you may say that it's exactly the opposite of Paul, because for Paul, this sacrifice that Jesus made is the only thing about Jesus that, is remarkable about him.
Right, okay.
Whereas,
yeah, and he doesn't give a lot of wisdom. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, in this, it's all about what he said.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's more. Like, did the author of the Gospel of Thomas believe that Jesus had a physical body. Again, this is unclear. There is one saying, saying 28, where Jesus says, I took my place in the midst of the world and I appeared to them in flesh. And then, because this saying survives also in Greek, scholars, again, disagreed about whether the Greek word often literally appeared, right? Whether it should be taken in the sense of like, was this apparition. I gave you the illusion of being
right, like a Docetist position.
Yeah. Or is it the real deal? Is he saying what we think he's saying? And again, I mean, why not? The Gospel of Thomas doesn't care much about the facts of Jesus' life. So again, whether or not he was in the flesh at some point does not seem to be a crucial fact. So I don't think we should definitely say, no, this doesn't mean that he appeared in the flesh. This must have some, second layer, this saying. Doesn't have to.
But the reason people might be listening going, what do you mean that doesn't matter? What's going on? The reason it might matter is because, and maybe this is the time to turn to this, you've identified some strongly, let's call them Middle Platonist philosophical ideas resonating within this curious document. And it might be worth talking about that because indeed, one of the reasons that this document, we might want to read it as being anti-cosmos and saying the cosmos is not that important, is because the author thinks that the cosmos is an icon. It's not the primary reality, right? And that does indeed seem to be the position of the author. So in that case, surely it is significant whether or not Jesus, or it could potentially be significant whether or not Jesus had a physical body or not, right?
Sure. No, I mean, the fact that Jesus was somehow sarkikos, that he had flesh, it doesn't, even if the Gospel of Thomas is saying that, which it might, it doesn't, of course, mean that flesh is good.
Right, yeah.
But you can construe it in the sense that, Jesus, this teacher, this divine being, who is obviously not very fond of flesh, still somehow was in the flesh, which gives hope to all of us, something like that. So about Platonism and about the theological profile of the Gospel of Thomas in general.
Yeah.
The general problem with the Gospel of Thomas is that it's a text that kind of refuses to allow you to label it. So, we, the scholars especially, we like to pigeonhole things. We like to assign to create categories and to divide text into groups. So we came up with all these smart notions of, Valentinianism, Sethianism, Hermeticism. So with the Gospel of Thomas, this is very difficult. It's very difficult to label it and then not to immediately get, a critique from somebody explaining why this label doesn't work.
Yeah.
That's, by the way, one of the reasons why, this Thomasine Christianity concept, I think, is it explains why it came about, but it doesn't make it any more, convincing.
Yeah.
So when the scholars discovered the Gospel of Thomas, the first word they tried to use was, of course, Gnosticism. And I'm sure there was a lot of discussion about Gnosticism on your podcast. The problem with Gnosticism, generally speaking, is the definition. And, there has been a lot of talk about what is Gnostic and what isn't Gnostic. With the Gospel of Thomas, I think today the consensus says that it's really, really unlikely that any meaningful definition be applied to it.
Of Gnosticism.
Of Gnosticism, yes.
Yeah.
So usually when we talk about Gnosticism, let's assume that this is a concept that we can use and that is meaningful. Gnosticism is about dualism, right? It's about the good God who is somehow above the universe, somewhat completely transcendental, and the bad God, the demiurge, that is responsible for all the bad, for the creation of the material world, stuff like that. So this dualism is very hard to find in the Gospel of Thomas. So the Gospel of Thomas is certainly negative about, flesh, materiality, the world as, the material universe. But it's very hard to find the notion of two gods in the Gospel of Thomas.
Right.
The closest to it is saying 100, which is really, really difficult, and where the word God appears like for the only time in this text. So in the saying 100, Jesus is shown a golden coin, and then people say to him, "Caesar's men demand taxes from us." And then he says, "Give Caesar what belongs to Caesar, give God what belongs to God, and give me what is mine." So somehow Jesus is not God. God and Jesus are two different entities. Does it mean that this God is the demiurge, that it's the evil creator of the material universe? It might, but not necessarily so. And I would argue that, this one saying is definitely not enough to associate the Gospel of Thomas with the text that very explicitly state that there are two gods. So the idea of Gnosticism didn't really work. And then if the concept that I really liked, even though I cannot say that I agree with it, but I think it's a brilliant attempt to offer like a holistic reading of the Gospel of Thomas, was this book by Stephen Davis, which I believe was called The Gospel of Thomas and Christian Wisdom, where its author argued that Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas is the embodied wisdom of the Old Testament.
The Sophia.
And the Sophia
Right.
Of the sapiential books of the Old Testament. And that, the text is thoroughly influenced by this literary tradition. And it's true that sometimes we cannot deny this sort of connection between Thomas and this strand of thought. The most amazing example is, I think, saying 38, where where Jesus says, "There will be days when you will look for me and you will not find me." And this is word for word what the Sophia says in, I think, the Book of Wisdom. And there's more proof to that. Like, it's really excellent what Davis does in his book when he tries to find all these parallels. The problem with this approach is that, the sapiential tradition is not really anti-cosmic.
Right.
Whereas the Gospel of Thomas is very much anti-cosmic.
Indeed.
So Davis,
There's in the sapiential tradition in the Old Testament, for listeners who aren't familiar with it, even blatantly doesn't have an afterlife of any sort. It's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you're dead. Like, this is the mindset of these wisdom books. We're not there anymore. We're in late antiquity now. Things have changed in late antiquity.
Quite much so. So there were different attempts to label the Gospel of Thomas mysticism. The word mysticism was used. Again, I think not really a very helpful category.
Yeah.
I'm referring specifically to the work of April DeConnick.
Mm-hmm.
And she was thinking about, what she termed something like early Jewish ascent mysticism. So this idea that before you die in this life, you can, follow certain practices and perform this spiritual ascent. So basically see the kavod, see the divine glory.
Yeah.
And if you do that, you won't die. So her emphasis was specifically on not dying and on, fulfilling this task in this life. And again, there is some evidence in support of this interpretation. Like the book she wrote was called Seek to See Him. So the idea is that, seek to see God before you die. Seek to see Him while you're still alive.
Yeah.
The problem is that the most important saying number 50, which contains some sort of a dialogue between the person who is instructed by the Gospel of Thomas and some evil heavenly forces, this dialogue is so clearly paralleled by a huge number of ancient texts where this sort of a conversation happens between a deceased person and some evil heavenly archons. So to argue that the Gospel of Thomas is all about heavenly ascent is this life is just, in my opinion, it's beyond what the evidence provides us. And actually, it does seem that the Gospel of Thomas does have this notion of some post-mortem heavenly journey.